Hello and welcome to episode 37 of the 905er podcast. My name is Roland Tanner.
I am Joel McLeod.
And we'll start off today with a quick reminder about supporting the 905er through Patreon. Joel and I are doing this podcast for the love of it, but also because we think it's important that our region has a media outlet that doesn't treat the millions of people who live in our cities as an afterthought. But we want to see the 905er grow into something bigger than just the two of us. We want to be able to pay for professional coverage, to spend the time needed to cover stories unique to our region with the level of detail they deserve. You can only do that with your help. Please consider becoming a monthly donor to the 905er via Patreon at patreon.com/the 905er. We're happy to say that Patreon has recently begun accepting Canadian dollars as a currency, and will also be offering annual subscriptions as an alternative to monthly payments, plus additional levels of support in the weeks ahead. And yes, we're also planning on offering awards to everybody who supports us. Watch this space. Our interview today picks up on an important story that is affecting thousands of Ontarians, but which has attracted relatively little attention, and that mainly on how it's affecting people in Toronto. Early in the COVID crisis, the province suspended all evictions and eviction proceedings. But that moratorium ended in the summer. Since then, the Landlord and Tenant Board has gotten back to work with gusto and has been processing large numbers of evictions via video call, regardless of the spread of COVID or the precarious financial circumstances many Ontarians are facing themselves in at the moment. To speak more about this issue, which applies to renters across the 905 region, we're speaking today with Alyssa Brierley, Executive Director and General Counsel at the Centre for Equality Rights and Accommodation. Alyssa is a 905er herself and grew up in Burlington, before training as a lawyer and standing as a candidate at the 2011 federal election. She then worked as Health, Social Justice and Labour Policy Advisor to the President of the Treasury Board of Ontario, and as the Director of Policy to the Minister of Economic Development, Employment and Infrastructure prior to 2018. As Executive Director of CIRA, Alyssa leads an organisation that both advocates for legal reform in housing and also provides services and advice to people facing eviction. Hey, well, welcome, Alyssa Brierley, to the 905 podcast. Really glad to have you on today. Just in the interest of just full disclosure, Alyssa is definitely someone who I count as a friend, and Joel and I have both known her for probably getting on for 10 years or so because of our political involvement in the past. And Alyssa was a candidate for the federal Liberal Party of Canada back in the day, but is now working at the Centre for Equality Rights. So, Alyssa, I wonder if you could just sort of kick us off by kind of giving us the background to this story. That, obviously with COVID, many of us have been under the impression that the government was kind of saying, don't be kicking people out of their homes during COVID, and yet it appears that something very different has been happening. I wonder if you could just give us the background to that story.
Sure, and thanks for having me on the podcast. It's great to be here. So, in terms of maybe it makes sense to sort of start back at the beginning of the pandemic, because I think part of what you said is right insofar as the government at the beginning of the pandemic took some action to make sure that nobody was losing their home. So you may recall back in March, there was a province-wide moratorium put on evictions, residential evictions. And that there were sort of two pieces to that moratorium. One was the moratorium on enforcing the orders themselves that came out of the process that everyone has to go through if they are going to be evicted at the Landlord Tenant Board. And the other part of the moratorium was the suspension of all activity with a few minor exceptions at the Landlord Tenant Board itself. So existing orders could not be enforced and no new orders could be sought. And that was as of March 19th. And that stayed throughout most of the summer as we had the state of emergency due to COVID. And in July, that order that was governing the moratorium was amended to allow for it to be lifted whenever the government lifted the state of emergency, which we know happened in August. So, or sorry, it happened in July. So as of August 1st, all of the eviction activity restarted. So hearings started resuming at the Landlord Tenant Board. Eviction orders that people had and had not been able to enforce for the previous several months started to be enforced in earnest. And it was really problematic because while the operations of the Landlord Tenant Board resumed, they obviously had to make some significant changes to the way that they operated to accommodate for the public health guidance around things like social distancing. So all sorts of changes were made. Hearings were being held by Zoom. And this caused a whole bunch of problems for tenants. Um, Moving online, we know creates significant barriers for people who are low income, who don't have access to appropriate technology, even for people who are outside of sort of core metropolitan areas that have trouble with connectivity issues. And we know that this isn't in, far off parts of the province. We know that parts of, Vaughan and York region don't have adequate internet connectivity. So when you're holding hearings that determine whether somebody's able to keep their home or not over internet through processes like Zoom, and somebody doesn't have adequate technology to allow that to happen, it's deeply problematic.
It should also be pointed out, just as an addendum, that in this past week we've had numerous reports of internet shortages here in the 905, like not the rural parts, like the urban areas, Burlington, Oakville, Mississauga, Peel, the high urban areas have been reporting widespread internet outages. And so I can imagine that, yeah, I mean, it's one of those things we take for granted in this country, that, oh, internet, yeah, we've got access to the internet. In a lot of cases, it has turned out to be quite spotty, even in the best of urban areas in the province. And so, yeah, I can see the problem of trying to rely on a tribunal or a meeting that will determine if somebody becomes homeless or not effectively is highly problematic, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, it's somewhat of an economic indicator of someone, someone who's about to be evicted probably isn't paying for the best internet connection anyway, so they're probably going to have the slower end of things, plus many people don't. Yeah, the assumption that everybody has it is just not genuine. And this story certainly has begun to make it into the media. I know Canada Land had an episode on this, and you obviously had your article that was published in Now magazine with and correct me if I'm pronouncing this wrong, Lani Farha, and you published on December the 15th. So it's started to sort of make itself into the media. So thus far, it's seemed to. Not so much actually in your article, but it's been kind of portrayed as a Toronto story to an extent. Is there anything that actually suggests this is something that affects people in Toronto more than, say, the 905, or is it just the same everywhere in essence?
Yeah, that's a great question. And no, it's definitely not a Toronto story by any stretch of the imagination. Toronto tends to get a lot of attention, I think, just by virtue of the fact that it's large and it has a large renter population. But this is happening all across the province, and yeah, it's happening all across the province. And I'll just add as well, in addition to the connectivity issue. That I mentioned earlier about just the ability to have kind of a straight or a functional internet connection. There are a whole bunch of other issues that are facing folks trying to navigate these procedures through this new sort of COVID environment. People are having a really hard time connecting with legal counsel to be able to get advice on how to approach the hearing. We know, and this is a problem that predates COVID for sure. There was a report put out by one of our colleague organizations, the Advocacy Centre for Tenants of Ontario, not too long ago that highlighted that 97% of renters facing an eviction hearing do not have legal representation or counsel, which is absolutely astonishing.
That's astounding.
And then in the midst of this, with in essence the Landlord Tenant Board, as I understand it, kind of trying to clear the backlog once they came back online. So kind of accelerating beyond the speed they would usually work at. We've also had a change in the law at the same time. So the government introduced Bill 184, which is no longer a bill, is now an act. I wonder if you could take us through the implications of that and how that might be affecting the process as well.
Yeah, definitely. And you're right, there is a lot happening all at the same time, and it's very challenging for tenants and those of whom who are lucky enough to be able to secure legal counsel or support from tenant duty counsel. They're all trying to figure this out. Bill 184, which is, you're right, is now in law. Was passed back in the summer, right around the time that the eviction moratorium was lifted in August. And it does a number of things. I'll focus on the ones that are the pieces that are sort of most serious for renters in Ontario. The sort of first big problem with the changes are that they do allow landlords to evict their tenants without a hearing when they find themselves in financial difficulties through no fault of their own. This applies where tenants who have signed repayment agreements in previous proceedings find themselves in financial difficulties and would like to renegotiate those repayment agreements. Prior to Bill 184 and the changes that it brought about, the tenant had a right to a hearing to have the opportunity to renegotiate those terms. Following Bill 184, that no longer happens as of right. And so we hear from people in these circumstances all the time. These tend to be very vulnerable people. And I'll give you a couple of examples. A senior on a fixed income who ran into some trouble, fell into arrears with their rental payments. They go through the process at the Landlord Tenant Board. They get a repayment agreement, save the tenancy. They're on a fixed income, and then something happens with their sort of income payments that get recalculated. And we know, particularly for folks who are on social assistance, there's all sorts of ways in which recalculations are triggered and are remedied down the road because there was some screw up in the system that triggered some sort of, like I said, recalculation of their monthly amount. But that could be sufficient to cause somebody to go into arrears, and they would not have the ability to go back and renegotiate that as of right. That's one example. Another example, so the types of folks who would also be in a similar circumstance. Single parents whose sort of former partner is paying support payments, and that stops for whatever reason. That person finds themselves in a situation where they just don't have the money to pay their rent for a period of time. And rather than being able to go back to the board and renegotiate that repayment agreement, they instead just simply lose their home. So it's quite serious. And we know that those types of issues those types of situations are gonna happen for the folks who are most vulnerable.
And obviously not everybody who is evicted immediately ends up on the streets, or I guess not. Otherwise, it feels like there'd be even larger armies of people on the streets. But what is the prognosis isn't the right word, but what is the outcome for people who are evicted, maybe because of no fault of their own, their economic circumstances just simply changed?
Well, the prognosis is not great. And what I would say is, we may not see a lot of homelessness but there is a lot more than people realize. There's about 235,000 Canadians every year experience homelessness. So we only see a small subset of those folks because what is most obvious to us are the individuals that we see sleeping rough on the streets or sleeping in parks. But there's a whole bunch of people who are, for example, sleeping in their cars, couch surfing, sleeping with friends and families, folks in the shelter system. There's 10,000 in Toronto's shelter system alone, for example. So they are there. Make no mistake. The numbers are higher than one would think. And when I came into this work for the first time, having not worked on the housing policy issues before joining CIRA back in October of 2018, I was astonished to understand sort of the scope and scale of this issue. It is unconscionable. The scope and scale of this issue. For folks who are just more directly to your question about what happens to these folks, I mean, really, the most vulnerable individuals will simply become homeless because when they lose their homes, they're not going to be able to afford rent at the current levels. Which, sorry to use a Toronto sort of number, but pre-pandemic that was $2,300 for a one bedroom apartment, and we know that the rents in the GTH or the greater Toronto Hamilton area, the rest of the 905, are trending in a similar pattern. And in fact, the rents in Burlington are higher than the rents in Toronto. So it is a dire situation for folks in this area. And at this point, their options are very often to find a place in the shelter system, sleep with friends and family, which is increasingly difficult to do with COVID. Otherwise, we are looking at homelessness on a pretty significant scale.
Um, this might be outside your realm of expertise, Alyssa, but I'm wondering maybe you can speak of the fact because I've always been puzzled as to why they change the rules surrounding evictions and tenant rights in the middle of this pandemic. And as somebody who is engaged in this and sees the effects of this on the everyday person, if you will, uh, like can you is there a rationale behind why would we do this in the middle of a global pandemic? I can understand maybe the Tory government had this on their agenda book for a while. This was a policy that they wanted to implement, but like right now, people the people who would be most affected by these evictions are people of precarious work or working in restaurants or retail that all of a sudden now that job isn't as steady as it once was. Why make it even more precarious for these people by saying, yeah, not only is your employment on shaky ground, now your residency is as well. And do you know why this of all times we would want to mess with this system in this manner?
I think that's a great question. And I think a lot of us working in this area have been scratching our heads to try to figure this out. Um, I have a few thoughts. I know, sort of a generous interpretation, and then there's sort of a less generous interpretation. I think, I do know that the provincial government has for some time had an agenda for modernization of the justice system and sort of a broad mandate to increase the use of technology. So, in terms of the technological change, I know that that's been on the radar for quite some time and something they've been trying to move forward with. And in some circumstances, it may make sense when faced with a situation where you can't proceed with in-person proceedings to look to facilitate that. I think it's probably more appropriate for, say, a commercial or a corporate context, maybe, and certainly less appropriate for the context where we're dealing with vulnerable individuals for whom the outcome of the proceeding is so fundamentally life altering. So that's on the technological side. In terms of the substantive changes to the law, I mean, that speaks to more, I think, a broader question of who government speaks to and who government understands, and who who and what interests are sort of front and center for governments. And I don't think, from what we have seen from this government, that it is vulnerable tenants.
It's very frustrating, obviously, that, I mean, this seems to be a part of a wider picture of what happened in the fall in this province. Taking this out into sort of the wider picture, obviously your work at Centre for Equality, Rights and Accommodation is to do with everybody's right to accommodation and how that should work. What would the bigger picture kind of fix be? What would you like, given a willing government and limitless resources or whatever? What do you think should happen in the province? A, in the short term now to deal with COVID, and B, in the longer term to sort of handle the issues with affordable housing and tenants' rights that we've seen?
That is a great question, and
it's kind of a huge one. I'm sorry.
Get comfortable, because I have a probably quite a lengthy answer, and maybe just to back up a step, I think it's helpful to diagnose the problem a little bit more specifically, because housing is a pretty complex area, and there's lots of things that are going on that have contributed to the problem. But I think, from my perspective, there's a few key problems that need to be solved. One of, and we got to where we are now because of I think of a few primary things that have happened. One in particular, significant disinvestment by governments in social housing, and the lack of construction of purpose-built rentals. And that's a problem that you both, I'm sure, are aware has been happening over several decades. So that's one thing. Another thing is the sort of on an individual level, the incentives that individual landlords have to move tenants along and increase rents, which is something that we deal with at CIRA sort of on an individual basis with the clients that reach out to us for help. And then the third area is the increasing financialization of housing, which is just this pernicious thing that is happening in the background that many people kind of know of, but aren't really sure how it's impacting things. So maybe if you'll indulge me, I'll just say a few things about each of those areas,
Sure.
about each of those before moving on to the what we can do about it. So in terms of government investment in affordable housing, we know that the federal government, in particular, pulled out of investing in housing in the 90s, and there's been almost no social or subsidized housing built since then. We also know that when it comes to sort of where people find their rental housing options, that a significant majority of the large multi-unit buildings that have been constructed since the 90s have been condos and not purpose-built rentals, and that's because of incentives for the folks who are building them. It's better, and you're going to make more money if you build a condo as opposed to a rental building, and then you don't have to deal with people, which is for a developer or a property manager a plus. And so it's simply the demand is not keeping pace with the need, and that is like if you boil it down, that is what economists call a market failure. It's a classic market failure in sort of the traditional economic sense of the word. So that's the sort of scope of the problem. And I think when we talk about what needs to be done about that, we need to find ways to incentivize, or governments need to get back into the business of providing funding and funding for the kinds of housing that the market isn't going to be building, and also find ways to incentivize the kind of the construction of the kind of housing that the market needs. There's very few areas of policy areas where when you see a market failure for 3 decades, governments fail to act. And for some reason, we're just allowing that to happen over and over and over again. And it's not as though this isn't an issue that's important for people, because every election that comes around, the issue of affordability keeps making it to the top of the list. Well, what costs people the most amount sort of out of their pocket is their housing costs. So when we talk about affordability, that's just a shorthand for housing in many cases, right? So that's sort of the first major problem that needs to be solved. On an individual level, when I mentioned landlords and sort of the incentives that they have to evict tenants, we hear about this all the time. We get calls from people who've been in their homes for 20 to 30 years, for example. They could be paying $800 a month rent because rent control prevents landlords from raising rents more than a certain amount from year to year, so long as they, so long as they're in a building that qualifies. And if that individual, if the landlord can find a way to get that person out, they can reset that market rent at the current rate, which, as I mentioned, at least in Toronto, was $2,300 and not far behind in the rest of the 905. There is a huge incentive to move people along. And we hear about this, like I said, all the time. We get calls from people who are one day late on their rent for the first time in 10 years, and they're getting an eviction notice. So that type of behavior needs to really, there needs to be some way of addressing that behavior, because that is not helpful for that's not helpful for individual tenants. It's also not helpful for the market, because it just leads to a massive escalation in the price of the market.
And this is a difficult question, and one if I was still sort of involved firsthand in politics, I probably wouldn't mention, because it's one that progressives have been as bad at handling as the conservatives, and that there is a problem with rent control, that we understand why it's there, but the Conservatives are right insofar as it does massively disincentivize building affordable housing. Now, maybe rent control would work if governments were also doing the investment to build affordable housing, to make sure that the supply is there, but they're not. I mean, is there any country in the world? I mean, I'm sure listeners are sick and tired of hearing me talking about how the fact they grew up in Britain and it's different there. And it's not, I don't raise these things because I think it's better, because it's often far worse, but it's different and it's an interesting contrast. Britain has massive, massive, massive supplies of municipal government-built housings. And, things are still expensive there. I mean, it doesn't solve everything, but why do you think that in North America as a whole, the idea of building the supply that we need in a non-private sector way, and then renting it out? I mean, the houses that were built in the town where I grew up in the 1950s are still being rented out year after year after year. I assume it's a kind of profitable enterprise now after all that time, that the municipal government is basically a landlord with a very large supply of stock. Why have we been so reluctant to go down that road here?
That's a great question. That's a really great question. I mean, I think part of it is we're seeing sort of the legacy, as strange as it may seem to say, because it was quite some time ago, but I think we're still seeing the legacy of the sort of Thatcher Reagan approach to social policy playing out here. And we had a particular approach of dealing with housing until the 90s, and then a switch was flicked, and that hasn't been revisited in a serious way since that time. I will say, with the a very important caveat that we now have, as of a few years ago, a national housing strategy, and as of last June 2019, a National Housing Strategy Act that gets the federal government back into housing in a big way, and in a way that it hasn't been involved in 30 years. So I'm a bit of an optimist. Some may call me naive, but I'm an optimist because I have to be. When you work in politics and deal with issues like these, I think that this is a game changer, and I think that this is the start of revisiting this policy failure that has happened for decades. And you know, we've talked about sort of our involvement in politics to this point. I will say that it was the Liberals who, you know, in government in the 90s that made that decision. So you know, nobody has clean hands on this. You know, we all bear the responsibility of those decisions that have had very significant implications on people's lives. What's really exciting to me about the National Housing Strategy Act, and this probably won't come as a surprise to either of you because we've talked about this. Is the fact that it's grounded in human rights, and it starts off by recognizing and committing to progressively implement the right to housing, which really turns a lot of this conversation on its head. Because when you talk about something as a matter of policy, it becomes a thing that, how do I say this? When something's a policy, it's kind of a nice to have. And governments can sort of make decisions on it the way that they make decisions on anything else. When you recognize something as a human right, it fundamentally changes the way that we talk about that thing. It is elevated to a level of importance, which means you can't just turn it off and on whenever you feel like it. You can't just pay attention to it when it's convenient for you. And you can't just sort of cut it out of the budget because you're trying to get to balance. Governments toy with and mess around with human rights at their peril. And as the sort of sector that I work in becomes increasingly aware of and has the capacity to understand and frame the work that we're doing in the context of human rights, this culture of housing as a human rights, I see it sort of firsthand with the work that I'm doing, is growing, and people understand it. People understand that housing is a human right because they know how important it is to them, and they get it. It's very intuitive.
I wanted to kind of take that note and kind of bring the conversation back a bit, because right now we're still in this pandemic. There are a lot of people who are I don't know, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but a lot of people are currently unemployed or they're underemployed, and they're in very precarious financial situations. Um, and the ability now to go in and I know the province has implemented a moratorium once again on evictions, but in my mind, as we've kind of discussed, it's just pushing the problem down the road. At one point, those people have to go back to a landlord tenant tribunal and plead for them to stay or renegotiate or whatever, and they very well may be evicted from their homes. Which, if you, as we've discussed, there could be a tsunami of homelessness coming our way in 2021 or post COVID, whenever we're out of this mess. And I bring this up because everyone's talking about, oh, the economic recovery. You know, we need the economy to come back and whatnot. And it dawned on me as we were discussing, how hard is it for an economic recovery when you have such a huge number of people who are potentially homeless? I mean, how are those people able to re-engage into the economy in a meaningful way, not just, you know, paycheck to paycheck, but somebody who has an education, a background, a diploma, degree, whatever, to now go back in and say, oh, well, I want to start up a business. I want to be able to be hired, yet you have no permanent fixed address to put on the job application. And you know, I find this is all connected. It's not you know, this problem is happening over here and evictions are happening over here. I find that they're very much connected if we want to come out stronger post COVID-19. Maybe you want to touch on that in your experience with the issue, Alyssa.
Yeah, absolutely. Another great question. And you know, the specific question of, you know, how, to what extent is an economic recovery possible where such a significant portion of the population is facing housing precarity? I mean, I think the answer is it's impossible. We know that people can't succeed without homes, and that, you know, that exists for everyone, without exception, right? I mean, without a stable home, your health outcomes are worse, your employment outcomes are worse, your mental health suffers. It is a real and significant problem for everyone, and of course it affects different people differently based on, to your point, sort of folks who are recent grads who are sort of looking to get into the job market versus, the individual who is sleeping rough on the street or in a tent in the local park. But it may not seem this way, but they are facing very similar circumstances in terms of housing precarity, and so we run the risk of having this very significant social problem affecting people right across a range of demographics in a way that we haven't really seen before. Um, I think governments would be switching from sort of the housing as a human right angle and just sort of talking, about this as a matter of pure policy. I think governments would be wise to keep in mind the importance of housing when they look at a recovery, because it is not going to be possible. It's not unlike sort of some of the conversations that are happening with respect to childcare. There is a whole swath of the population who are not going to be able to get back to work if they don't have the ability to have childcare. And it's no different with housing at all. So I think it's important to look at these things holistically. I sincerely hope that is the way that this is going to be viewed. You made another comment as well, sort of earlier in your remarks, that I just want to respond to as well, which is kicking the can down the road. Whether this kicks the can down the road, the current eviction moratorium. And I should actually just flag as well, because I don't know that I said this at the beginning, but as of yesterday, the moratorium on the enforcement of eviction orders was reinstated. So as of at least yesterday at 6 p.m., which is when I understand it took effect. So that would be January 13th at 6 p.m. No residential eviction orders will be enforced for the duration of the emergency order. So that helps people in the immediate term, but you're absolutely right. It kicks the can down the road. People who don't have an income right now are still unable to pay their rent, and they're simply accumulating arrears and unable to clear those arrears to be able to stay in their homes. That is a very significant problem. And without some kind of an intervention by government, there will be a tsunami of evictions when this is all over. And it will bring all of the sort of pernicious implications. I cannot imagine what our province and region would look like with evictions of the scale that we are looking at, but it is terrifying.
And my this may be my bias is speaking, but I don't think it is. Again and again and again, you feel with things like this, which fair enough, this is not a monopoly of conservative governments. Like you said, this whole thing began with a Liberal government. The end up, if you're doing it purely on the basis of cost and what the government has to pay to keep people healthy, this is the more expensive road to go, because, like you say, mental health, drug addiction, all these things that go along with people living in desperate circumstances are so expensive to deal with, and we could avoid all of that with sure, a little bit of expense now, and maybe a substantial amount of expense now, but it will be less substantial than what we're paying down the road. So it's frustrating, and you feel. I mean, I've said this I don't know how many times now. The sort of hope that we come out of this period in our history, kind of with the same attitude as we had at the end of the Second World War, was like, okay, home's fit for heroes. We're going to build a sort of brave new world that is better than what we had before. After this cataclysm that we went through, I have my doubts that it will happen, but it would be. I'd really like to see, fundamental changes in thinking about things like, there's basic income. There's, we did an episode on basic income a few months ago.
Yep.
And it relates so much to what we've been talking about today, and that Jesse
Golem. Jesse Golem and Deirdre Pike were our guests that day.
So Jesse was on the basic income pilot in Hamilton, and she spoke about how it just fundamentally changed her outlook on what was possible in life. And then, of course, when it was taken away again, she's back to working to exist rather than working to live, with a very talented person with all kinds of skills and talents that she hoped to be able to, but all the time she was, subsistent, working as a waitress or whatever. She was kind of stuck in this cycle. This is the same thing, that all the time people are dealing with accommodation and so on. They're stuck where they don't need to be, these are people with talent and capability who could be contributing to the economy who are not. As usual, I've just said something that doesn't end with a question mark, but feel free to comment on that.
I think you're absolutely right, Roland. And I think, I think we're at a bit of a crossroads to sort of, add to what you're saying. I think we have options at this point. Like, we have options in terms of what does rebuilding look like after something as significant as a global pandemic and what it's done to our economy. And we have choices in front of us. And I think, we can choose to rebuild what we had, which was, a system that for the most part relied on people to take care of themselves. And if they made it, great. And if not, we would sort of throw them a few crumbs and call it a day. Or we can build something that allows people to be the best versions of themselves and enables them, and we all end up better and we win in the end. And I think that that's a really obvious and easy choice to make. And I really hope that that's what we're looking at the end of this, because I think we fail and continue to fail to solve these problems at our peril. There's so much wasted talent. There's so much wasted opportunity. And for what? Ideology, because we think that people should be able to figure it out on their own. It just doesn't make any sense.
Well, I think it comes down to, where do we put our priorities in terms of our society? Do we, I think we're learning that there are certain basic needs that we really ought to be taken care of. And when I think that this pandemic is, I kind of said that from the beginning, this pandemic has kind of magnified all these inequalities and all these problems that we've had over the years, and that we're now dealing with it. We realize people shouldn't be spending their energies wondering how they're going to live day to day. They shouldn't be wondering how do they put food on the table, and are they still going to have a roof over their heads tomorrow. That doesn't. If we want to have a thriving, prosperous, productive economy and society, that's not the lesson we should be taking away from people, or telling our children. I hope that that COVID-19 has kind of made us check that, and maybe made us to re-examine and reevaluate and say, what can we do, and more importantly, what ought we do to help each other out. Well, I would going to close off the episode with that, and I'd like to thank you, Alyssa, for coming on and joining us today out of your busy schedule. And hopefully we can have you on at some point in a future episode, and hopefully we'll have better news to share.
Yeah, and perhaps we'll look forward, Alyssa, to maybe seeing you in person sometime in the future as well.
All of those would be wonderful. Thanks for having me.
That's it for this episode of the 905er. Thank you for listening. As always, you can send us your feedback, thoughts, and concerns, or ideas for future episodes to our email, info@905er.ca. We'd love to hear from you. You can help us keep the 905er going by financially supporting us through Patreon as well as PayPal. Visit us at 905er.ca and click on the support tab. As well, links are in the show notes for your convenience. Lastly, you can find us on social media. Search for _905er on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So long for now. See you next time.
You looking to make the most out of this life and optimize your personal wellness? Then check out the Natural Man Podcast. Join me, host Mike C., as we explore all areas of human wellness, physical, mental, and emotional. Learn strategies to optimize your own well-being and be in the driver's seat of your own health. Remember, your doctor works for you. Learn biohacks, neurohacks, ways to improve sleep, and ways to optimize your body and your mind. Check us out on Apple, Spotify, the Fountain app, and at naturalmanpodcast.com.